Alphonse Gabriel Capone ruled Chicago with an iron fist and a Tommy gun, transforming from a Brooklyn street thug into America's most notorious gangster. By 1928, his bootlegging empire generated over $100 million annually, making him more powerful than mayors and police chiefs combined. The scar-faced kingpin lived like royalty in his Miami mansion, throwing lavish parties while his enemies turned up floating in the Chicago River. But what brought down the untouchable Al Capone wasn't bullets or rival gangs, it was something far more mundane and devastating. The federal government couldn't prove murder, couldn't nail him for bootlegging, couldn't touch him for the countless crimes that built his empire. Instead, they got him on tax evasion, 11 counts that would shatter the myth of his invincibility. The trial lasted just 3 weeks, and suddenly, the King of Chicago was headed to Atlanta Federal Penitentiary. Prison broke Capone in ways the streets never could. Syphilis ravaged his mind, turning the sharp criminal mastermind into a confused shadow of his former self. By the time he was released in 1939, neighbors in Miami reported seeing him fishing in his pool, talking to imaginary companions, his empire nothing but fading newspaper headlines. When Capone died of cardiac arrest in 1947, his family buried him in Mount Olivet Cemetery in Chicago's South Side. The simple granite headstone reads only Alphonse Capone, with birth and death dates, no mention of Scarface, no reference to his criminal legacy. The grave sits in Section 36, a modest plot that draws thousands of visitors each year, all seeking the final resting place of America's most infamous mobster. John Joseph Gotti strutted through New York like a peacock in an Armani suit, earning the nickname the Dapper Don for his $1,000 outfits and movie star smile. He transformed the Gambino crime family from shadowy operators into front-page celebrities, holding court at his Ravenite social club in Little Italy, while FBI agents watched from across the street. The media loved him, the public was fascinated, and prosecutors couldn't touch him as case after case collapsed in courtrooms across Manhattan. But Gotti's love affair with fame would become his destruction, and the betrayal came from within his own inner circle. Salvatore "Sammy the Bull" Gravano, his underboss and closest confidant, secretly recorded hundreds of conversations that revealed the brutal reality behind the flashy exterior. When federal prosecutors played those tapes in court, America heard Gotti casually discussing murders, beatings, and extortion with the cold calculation of a corporate executive reviewing quarterly reports. The Teflon Don's coding finally cracked in 1992 when a jury convicted him on 13 counts, including murder and racketeering. Sentenced to life without parole, Gotti was shipped to the federal Supermax prison in Marion, Illinois, where his designer suits were replaced with orange jumpsuits and his empire crumbled without its charismatic leader. Prison guards found Gotti dead in his cell on June 10, 2002, throat cancer having claimed the man who once ruled the streets of Queens. His family buried him at St. John's Cemetery in Middle Village, Queens, beneath a towering granite monument that reads John J. Gotti in bold letters. The elaborate headstone, decorated with carved roses and religious imagery, sits in a prominent section where visitors still leave flowers and notes drawn to the final resting place of New York's last celebrity gangster. Charles "Lucky" Luciano earned his nickname not from good fortune, but from surviving a brutal beating and throat slashing that should have killed him in 1929. The attack left him with a drooping right eye and a scar across his throat, but it also transformed him into the architect of modern organized crime. Luciano abolished the old Mustache Pete traditions, created the commission to settle disputes between families, and turned chaotic street gangs into a sophisticated criminal corporation that would dominate America for decades. His empire stretched from New York's docks to Hollywood's studios, controlling everything from labor unions to politicians with mathematical precision. But Lucky's luck ran out when prosecutor Thomas Dewey built an airtight case around his prostitution network, something the newspapers called the trial of the century. The evidence was overwhelming. Witnesses testified to his control over every brothel in Manhattan, and in 1936, Lucky Luciano became the first major mob boss convicted and sentenced to 30 to 50 years in state prison. World War II changed everything when the U.S. Navy desperately needed his help securing the waterfront from German saboteurs. In exchange for his cooperation, Lucky received something no one thought possible: deportation to Italy instead of decades behind bars. But freedom came with a price: permanent exile from the country he had helped reshape through violence and corruption. Lucky Luciano died of a heart attack at Naples Airport in 1962, reportedly on his way to meet a Hollywood producer about a movie deal. His body lies in St. John Cemetery in Middle Village, Queens, the same burial ground as John Gotti, beneath a simple headstone that reads Charles Luciano. The modest grave marker gives no hint that beneath the earth rests the man who created the blueprint for American organized crime. His final resting place, drawing pilgrims who understand his true legacy. Benjamin Bugsy Siegel moved through Hollywood like a movie star himself, his handsome features and violent reputation making him irresistible to starlets and socialites who thrilled at dancing with danger. The New York killer turned West Coast operator rubbed shoulders with George Raft and Jean Harlow, while secretly running murder contracts, drug operations, and illegal gambling across Los Angeles. Nobody dared call him Bugsy to his face, the nickname driving him into homicidal rages that left bodies scattered across California. But Siegel's greatest vision would also become his death sentence when he convinced his mob partners to invest millions in a revolutionary idea: a luxury casino resort in the middle of the Nevada desert. The Flamingo Hotel was supposed to transform Las Vegas from a dusty railroad stop into America's gambling capital, but construction costs spiraled out of control while Siegel lived like a king in Beverly Hills. When the casino's opening night in December 1946 turned into a humiliating disaster with empty tables and fleeing customers, his New York backers began sharpening their knives. The end came with brutal efficiency on June 20, 1947, when Siegel sat reading the Los Angeles Times in girlfriend Virginia Hill's Beverly Hills mansion. A gunman fired 9 shots through the living room window, the first bullet tearing through his right eye and blowing out the back of his skull. Police found his eyeball 15 feet away on the marble floor. Siegel's body rests in Hollywood Forever Cemetery in Los Angeles, his grave marked by a simple bronze plaque that reads, Benjamin Siegel with the Star of David. The modest marker sits in the Jewish section, surrounded by palm trees and within sight of the Hollywood sign, a fitting final location for the mobster who dreamed of building an empire in the desert but died before seeing Las Vegas become exactly what he envisioned. Meyer Lansky never carried a gun, rarely raised his voice, and looked more like an accountant than America's most powerful organized crime figure. But his mathematical mind transformed the mob from street thugs into a sophisticated financial empire. The diminutive genius from Poland created the template for money laundering, established the first offshore banking networks, and built a criminal corporation that generated billions while keeping his own name out of newspaper headlines. FBI agents called him the most dangerous man in America, not because he killed people, but because he made crime profitable on an industrial scale. Lansky's empire stretched from the casinos of Las Vegas to the beaches of Havana, where he partnered with Cuban dictator Fulgencio Batista to turn the island into a gambling paradise for wealthy Americans. But Castro's revolution in 1959 wiped out his Cuban investments overnight. And suddenly the man who had hidden fortunes around the world found himself scrambling to recover millions from Swiss bank accounts and shell companies scattered across 3 continents. The final decades brought constant FBI surveillance and IRS investigations as federal agents desperately tried to prove Lansky possessed the legendary fortune they estimated at $300 million. But when the mob's financial mastermind died of lung cancer in 1983, investigators discovered the shocking truth: his estate was worth less than $60,000. Lansky lies buried in Mount Nebo Cemetery in Miami Beach, beneath a simple granite headstone that bears only his name and dates of birth and death. The modest grave sits in a quiet section overlooking Biscayne Bay, giving no indication that beneath the Florida soil rests the man who taught organized crime how to count money instead of just stealing it, taking the secrets of his hidden billions to the grave. Frank Costello earned the title Prime Minister of the Underworld, not through violence, but through his genius for corruption, transforming bribery into an art form that reached from beat cops to Supreme Court justices. The smooth-talking Italian immigrant built the most sophisticated political machine in American history, controlling judges, mayors, and congressmen with carefully distributed envelopes of cash and strategic favors. His apartment on Central Park West became an unofficial embassy where politicians and gangsters conducted business over imported cigars and aged whiskey. The Kefauver Committee hearings in 1951 turned Costello into America's most famous mobster when television cameras captured his nervous hands drumming on the witness table while he repeatedly pleaded the Fifth Amendment. Millions of Americans watched those restless fingers and heard that gravelly voice refuse to answer questions about slot machines, political payoffs, and murder contracts, making Frank Costello a household name overnight. But fame brought unwanted attention from ambitious rivals, and on May 2, 1957, a gunman waited in the lobby of his apartment building with orders to eliminate the aging boss. The bullet grazed his skull, leaving a permanent scar but missing his brain by inches. Costello survived what others intended as his execution. Unlike most of his contemporaries, Costello died peacefully in his sleep on February 18, 1973, his heart finally giving out after decades of stress and survival. His family laid him to rest in St. Michael's Cemetery in Queens, beneath a modest granite headstone that simply reads, Francis Costello. The understated grave reflects the man's preference for operating in shadows rather than seeking headlines. His final resting place, visited by those who remember when corruption was conducted with old-world elegance rather than crude violence. Vito Genovese clawed his way to power through a trail of blood and betrayal that shocked even hardened criminals, earning a reputation as the most ruthless boss in the American mafia's murderous hierarchy. The Neapolitan immigrant eliminated rivals with surgical precision, ordering the deaths of anyone who threatened his climb to the top of what would become the most powerful crime family in New York. His cold eyes and calculating mind made him feared by soldiers and capos who knew that crossing Vito meant a one-way trip to a shallow grave. But Genovese's paranoid nature and explosive temper would ultimately destroy the empire he built through decades of violence and intimidation. In 1957, he ordered the botched assassination attempt on Frank Costello, then made the fatal mistake of calling the disastrous Appalachian meeting that exposed the mafia's existence to the American public. When law enforcement raided the upstate New York gathering, they found nearly 60 mob bosses fleeing through the woods like common criminals, shattering the organization's code of secrecy forever. Federal prosecutors finally cornered Genovese on narcotics charges in 1959, convicting him of conspiracy to import and sell heroin despite his lifelong claims that drugs were beneath the dignity of true organized crime figures. The 15-year sentence sent him to Atlanta Federal Penitentiary, where other inmates whispered that the aging Don still ran his family through coded messages and carefully orchestrated visits. Vito Genovese died of a heart attack in his prison cell on February 14, 1969, Valentine's Day, proving grimly appropriate for a man who had spent his life breaking hearts and ending lives. His body returned to New York for burial in St. John's Cemetery in Middle Village, Queens, the same graveyard that holds Lucky Luciano and John Gotti. The simple headstone reads Vito Genovese, with no mention of the family empire that still bears his name decades after his death. Salvatore Momo Giancana transformed from a small-time Chicago thief into one of the most powerful mob bosses in American history. But his taste for Hollywood glamour and political intrigue would ultimately sign his death warrant. The dapper gangster rubbed shoulders with Frank Sinatra and the Rat Pack, while secretly helping the CIA plot to assassinate Fidel Castro, creating a web of connections that reached from Las Vegas casinos to the White House. His romantic relationship with singer Phyllis McGuire of the McGuire Sisters made him a fixture in gossip columns and nightclub photographs. But Giancana's highest-profile connection would prove the most dangerous when he allegedly helped deliver Illinois electoral votes to John F. Kennedy in 1960, expecting political favors in return. Instead, the Kennedy administration launched an unprecedented crackdown on organized crime, with Attorney General Robert Kennedy targeting Giancana's operations with wiretaps, raids, and relentless surveillance that made the Chicago boss feel betrayed and furious. The final betrayal came from within his own organization when federal prosecutors prepared to call Giancana before a Senate committee investigating CIA assassination plots in 1975. Someone decided the aging boss knew too many secrets about government conspiracies and mob connections to risk his testimony. On June 19, 1975, an assassin entered Giancana's Oak Park home while he was cooking Italian sausages in his basement kitchen. 7 bullets to the head and neck silenced the man who had shared secrets with presidents and spies. His family buried him in Mount Carmel Cemetery in Hillside, Illinois, beneath a large granite monument marked Giancana that draws visitors curious about the mobster who operated at the intersection of organized crime, Hollywood, and Cold War politics, taking his most dangerous secrets to the grave. Carlo Gambino built the most powerful crime family in American history while maintaining the facade of a humble businessman. His soft-spoken manner and grandfatherly appearance concealing one of the most ruthless criminal minds of the 20th century. The Sicilian immigrant avoided flashy clothes and expensive cars, preferring to operate from his modest Brooklyn home, while his organization controlled everything from construction unions to waterfront shipping throughout New York. Law enforcement knew he was the boss of bosses, but Gambino's careful planning
In the
and
American
old-world
Mafia,
discipline made
there's
him nearly
probably
untouchable.
no man with
His genius lay in understanding that the most successful criminals were those who never appeared criminal at all, running his empire like a legitimate corporation while avoiding the spotlight that destroyed flashier contemporaries. Gambino survived decades of federal investigations and rival family wars by keeping his name out of newspapers and his business conducted through layers of insulation that made prosecutions nearly impossible. Unlike the violent ends that claimed most mob bosses, Carlo Gambino died peacefully of natural causes on October 15, 1976, surrounded by family at his Massapequa home on Long Island. His funeral drew thousands of mourners who lined the streets of Brooklyn, a testament to the respect and fear he commanded even in death. Gambino rests in St. John Cemetery in Middle Village, Queens, beneath an imposing granite mausoleum that bears the family name in bold letters. The elaborate tomb sits in a prominent location within the cemetery, reflecting the power and influence he wielded during his lifetime. Visitors still come to pay respects at the grave of the man who proved that in organized crime, the quietest voices often carry the most authority, building an empire that outlasted more famous but less disciplined rivals. Joseph Anthony Colombo Sr. shocked the criminal underworld by transforming from a traditional mob boss into an unlikely civil rights activist, founding the Italian-American Civil Rights League to combat what he called discrimination against people of Italian heritage. The charismatic leader organized massive rallies in Columbus Circle, drawing thousands of supporters while FBI agents watched in disbelief as a known crime family head gave speeches about prejudice and media stereotypes. His public crusade against the term mafia and his demands that Hollywood stop making movies about Italian-American criminals made him the most visible mob boss in American history. But Colombo's high-profile activism infuriated other crime family leaders who preferred operating in shadows rather than staging press conferences and television appearances. The commission viewed his attention-seeking behavior as a dangerous violation of the code of silence that had protected organized crime for generations, and whispers began circulating that Joe Colombo had lost his mind, along with his sense of self-preservation. The inevitable reckoning came on June 28, 1971, when Colombo took the stage at the second annual Italian-American Unity Day rally in Columbus Circle before thousands of cheering supporters. A gunman posing as a photographer approached the podium and fired 3 shots at point-blank range, the bullets tearing into Colombo's head and neck as horrified families scattered in panic. Colombo survived the assassination attempt but remained paralyzed and largely comatose for the remaining 7 years of his life, dying on May 22, 1978. His family buried him in St. John Cemetery in Middle Village, Queens, beneath a granite headstone that reads simply, Joseph A. Colombo Sr. The modest grave gives no indication of the man who dared to bring organized crime into the spotlight, paying the ultimate price for breaking the sacred rule of silence that had protected the mob for decades. Carmine Lillo Galante earned his reputation as the most feared man in organized crime through a combination of explosive violence and an ever-present cigar that became his trademark, the smoke curling around his cold eyes as he ordered executions with casual indifference. the Bonanno family underboss built a heroin empire that stretched from Sicily to New York streets, flooding American cities with drugs while maintaining the old-world Sicilian tradition that viewed narcotics trafficking as just another business opportunity. His nickname Lillo, meaning cigar in Sicilian dialect, perfectly captured the image that struck terror into rivals and subordinates alike. Prison only amplified Galante's ambitions when he spent 12 years in federal custody, planning his return to power and dreaming of becoming the capo di tutti capi, the boss of all bosses. Upon his release in 1974, he immediately began eliminating competitors and absorbing their operations with a brutality that shocked even hardened criminals. His systematic campaign of murder and intimidation aimed to unite all 5 New York families under his control, but the other bosses recognized the existential threat he represented. The commission decided that Carmine Galante had to die before he destroyed the delicate balance of power that kept organized crime profitable for everyone. On July 12, 1979, 3 masked gunmen entered Joe and Mary's Italian restaurant in Brooklyn while Galante enjoyed lunch on the back patio. The assassins fired over 20 shots, killing Galante instantly as he sat at his table, his trademark cigar still clenched between his teeth even in death. Galante lies buried in St. John's Cemetery in Middle Village, Queens, beneath a simple granite headstone bearing only his name and dates. The understated grave belies the fear he inspired during his lifetime. Visited by those curious about the mobster, whose insatiable ambition and trademark cigar made him both legendary and ultimately expendable in the ruthless world of organized crime. Paul "Big Paul" Castellano transformed the Gambino crime family from a traditional street operation into a sophisticated white-collar criminal enterprise. Preferring construction kickbacks and labor union corruption to the messy violence that had defined earlier generations of mobsters. The imposing boss lived like a corporate executive in his massive Staten Island mansion, complete with swimming pools and manicured gardens, while conducting business meetings in expensive suits rather than dimly lit social clubs. His emphasis on legitimate businesses and political connections made him incredibly wealthy, but also incredibly disconnected from the soldiers who still believed in old-school mob traditions. But Castellano's corporate approach to organized crime created dangerous enemies within his own family, particularly among the ambitious capos who viewed his reluctance to sanction murders as weakness rather than wisdom. John Gotti, then a rising captain in the Gambino organization, openly criticized Big Paul's leadership style and began plotting to seize control of the family through the most direct method available in the underworld. The coup came with brutal efficiency on December 16, 1985, when Castellano arrived at Sparks Steakhouse in Manhattan for what he believed was a routine dinner meeting with other family members. As he stepped out of his black Lincoln Continental, 4 gunmen emerged from the crowd of Christmas shoppers and opened fire, the shots echoing through the busy Midtown street as terrified pedestrians dove for cover. Paul Castellano lies buried in Moravian Cemetery on Staten Island, his grave marked by a large granite monument that bears his name and dates of birth and death. The cemetery sits on the same island where he built his mansion and attempted to legitimize organized crime, his final resting place serving as a reminder that in the world of the mafia, even the most successful businessmen can fall victim to those who still prefer guns to corporate boardrooms. Giovanni "Johnny" Torrio possessed something rare among gangsters of the Prohibition era: the wisdom to walk away from power while he was still alive to enjoy his fortune. The diminutive criminal mastermind from New York transformed Chicago's chaotic underworld into an organized empire, dividing territories between rival gangs and establishing the business principles that would guide organized crime for decades. Most importantly, he recognized the potential in a young Brooklyn thug named Al Capone, bringing him to Chicago as his lieutenant and teaching him the difference between ruling through fear and ruling through intelligence. But Torrio's genius lay in understanding when to quit, something that eluded most of his contemporaries who stayed in the game until bullets or prison cells claimed them. After surviving an assassination attempt by rival gang members in 1925, Torrio made a decision that shocked the criminal underworld by handing control of his entire Chicago operation to Capone and retiring to New York with his millions intact. The strategy worked perfectly, as Torrio lived quietly in Brooklyn, while his former protege battled rivals, federal agents, and eventually prison bars. While Capone's empire crumbled under government pressure, Torrio invested his bootlegging profits in legitimate businesses and real estate, transforming himself from public enemy number one into a respectable businessman. Johnny Torrio died peacefully in his sleep on April 16, 1957, one of the few major organized crime figures to escape violent death or lengthy prison sentences. His family buried him in Greenwood Cemetery in Brooklyn, beneath a simple granite headstone that gives no indication of his criminal past or the empire he built and wisely abandoned. The modest grave represents the ultimate success story in organized crime, belonging to the man who understood that the smartest gangsters are those who know when to stop being gangsters. Giuseppe Joe Bananas. Bonanno stood as one of the founding fathers of the American Mafia, helping establish the commission that governed organized crime families while building his own empire that stretched from New York to Arizona to Sicily. The Sicilian-born Don commanded respect through a combination of old-world honor and new-world business acumen, creating a crime family that operated more like a medieval dynasty than a street gang. His ability to avoid prosecution for decades while maintaining power over hundreds of soldiers made him legendary among law enforcement and criminals alike. But Bonanno's ambitions ultimately sparked the bloody conflict known as the Banana War when he attempted to eliminate rivals and consolidate control over multiple families in the 1960s. The commission declared him persona non grata, forcing him into hiding and exile while his own organization fractured into warring factions that killed each other in the streets of New York. The most shocking betrayal came from within his own bloodline when his son Salvatore Bill Bonanno began cooperating with federal authorities, providing information that would have been unthinkable under the strict codes of silence that governed traditional Sicilian families. Joe Bonanno lived to see his life's work crumble as former allies turned against each other and government prosecutors dismantled his carefully constructed empire piece by piece. Unlike most of his contemporaries, Bonanno died of natural causes on May 11, 2002, at the age of 97 in Tucson, Arizona, where he had spent his final decades writing his controversial autobiography, A Man of Honor. His family buried him in Holy Hope Cemetery in Tucson. Far from the New York streets where he once wielded absolute power, the simple headstone bearing his name sits beneath the Arizona sun, marking the final resting place of the last Don who remembered when organized crime was governed by ancient codes of honor rather than modern desires for wealth and publicity. Salvatore Maranzano arrived in America from Sicily with grandiose visions of recreating the ancient Roman Empire within the structure of organized crime, declaring himself Capo di tutti capi and designing elaborate hierarchies modeled after Caesar's legions. The educated Don spoke multiple languages, quoted Latin phrases, and insisted that American gangsters adopt the formal traditions and military discipline of their Sicilian ancestors. His victory in the bloody Castellamarese War against Joe Masseria in 1931 seemed to confirm his destiny as the supreme ruler of American organized crime. But Maranzano's imperial ambitions and old-world arrogance made him dangerous enemies among the younger generation of American-born criminals who viewed his Sicilian traditions as outdated obstacles to profit. Lucky Luciano, Meyer Lansky, and other rising stars recognized that Maranzano's authoritarian style would strangle the flexibility and innovation that made American crime families so successful during Prohibition. The new empire lasted exactly 5 months before Maranzano's former allies decided that his dreams of absolute power threatened everyone's survival. On September 10, 1931, 4 men posing as federal agents entered Maranzano's Park Avenue office and stabbed him 6 times before shooting him 4 times in the head. The assassination marked the end of the old Mustache Pete era and the beginning of modern organized crime. Maranzano lies buried in St. John's Cemetery in Middle Village, Queens, the same graveyard that would eventually hold Lucky Luciano, John Gotti, and dozens of other mob legends. His grave sits beneath a modest headstone that gives no indication of his brief reign as self-proclaimed emperor of the underworld, marking the final resting place of the man who dreamed of ruling America's criminals like a Roman general, but learned too late that empires built on betrayal rarely survive their first succession crisis. Arthur Dutch Schultz Fliegenheimer built his criminal empire on the simple principle that violence solved most business problems. transforming from a small-time Bronx thief into the beer baron of New York through a combination of brutal enforcement and mathematical precision. The volatile gangster controlled the numbers racket across Harlem, while simultaneously running one of the largest bootlegging operations on the East Coast, generating millions of dollars that he reportedly buried in secret locations throughout the Catskill Mountains. His explosive temper and willingness to kill anyone who crossed him made Dutch Schultz both feared and unpredictable in the carefully organized world of Prohibition-era crime. But Schultz's greatest enemy proved to be his own government, when prosecutor Thomas Dewey built a tax evasion case that threatened to send the beer baron to prison for decades. Desperate to avoid Capone's fate, Schultz made a decision that shocked even his criminal associates by proposing to assassinate the prosecutor, something the commission viewed as suicidal madness that would bring federal heat down on every family in America. The end came on October 23, 1935, when commission hitmen found Schultz in the men's room of the Palace Chop House in Newark, New Jersey. The gunshots left him mortally wounded but still conscious, leading to 24 hours of delirious rambling that police stenographers recorded word for word, creating one of the most bizarre documents in criminal history. Dutch Schultz lies buried in Gate of Heaven Cemetery in Hawthorne, New York, beneath a simple granite headstone that bears his real name, Arthur Flegenheimer. The modest grave gives no hint of the millions he allegedly hid in the mountains, making his final resting place a pilgrimage site for treasure hunters who still believe his cryptic dying words contained clues to buried fortunes that remain lost in the wilderness of upstate New York. Vincent the Chin Gigante perfected the most audacious act in organized crime history by pretending to be mentally incompetent for over 3 decades, shuffling through Greenwich Village in bathrobes and pajamas, while secretly running the most powerful crime family in America. The former professional boxer transformed himself into a mumbling, drooling figure who appeared to talk to parking meters and urinate on himself in public, all while FBI agents watched in frustration as their surveillance captured nothing but an apparently deranged old man wandering the streets. Behind the elaborate charade, Gigante commanded the Genovese family with iron discipline, ordering murders and managing criminal enterprises worth hundreds of millions of dollars through a network of loyal captains who understood his every gesture and whisper. The act was so convincing that even federal prosecutors struggled to prove he possessed the mental capacity to stand trial, allowing him to avoid prosecution for decades while less clever bosses rotted in prison cells. The performance finally cracked in 2003, when mounting evidence and testimony from family members forced Gigante to admit his deception in open court, pleading guilty to obstruction of justice and acknowledging that his insanity defense had been an elaborate fraud designed to avoid prosecution. Vincent Gigante died of heart failure on December 19, 2005, while serving his sentence at the Federal Prison Medical Facility in Springfield, Missouri. His family buried him in St. Raymond's Cemetery in the Bronx, beneath a granite headstone that simply reads, Vincent Gigante. The modest grave marker gives no indication of the man's incredible acting ability or the decades he spent fooling law enforcement, federal prosecutors, and even his own neighbors with the most successful insanity act in criminal history. Anthony "Tony the Ant" Spilotro earned his nickname not from his diminutive stature, but from his ability to burrow into Las Vegas like an insect, establishing the Chicago outfit's presence in the desert gambling capital through a reign of terror that left bodies buried throughout the Nevada wasteland. The sadistic enforcer specialized in torture and intimidation, using tools ranging from ice picks to electrical devices to extract information from victims while maintaining his cover as a legitimate businessman running an antique shop and restaurant. His partnership with casino operator Frank "Lefty" Rosenthal created a skimming operation that funneled millions from Las Vegas casinos back to Chicago bosses. But Spilotro's increasing violence and public profile began attracting unwanted federal attention to what should have been a quiet money-making enterprise. The FBI's surveillance of his activities, combined with his reckless affair with Rosenthal's wife Jerry, created a powder keg that threatened to expose the entire operation. Chicago bosses decided that Tony the Ant had become more liability than asset when his brutal methods and headline-grabbing crimes brought heat down on their carefully constructed Nevada empire. On June 14, 1986, Spilotro and his brother Michael were lured to what they believed was a promotion meeting in an Indiana basement. Instead, they found their deaths in the most brutal fashion imaginable, beaten with baseball bats and buried alive in an Indiana cornfield while still breathing. Anthony Spilotro lies buried in Queen of Heaven Cemetery in Hillside, Illinois, next to his brother Michael in matching granite plots. The side-by-side graves serve as a grim reminder that in organized crime, family loyalty means dying together. When the bosses decide your time is up, their final resting place, marking the end of the Chicago outfit's violent grip on Las Vegas. James Whitey Bulger represented the darkest evolution of American organized crime, a psychopathic killer who transformed FBI corruption into personal protection while terrorizing Boston's underworld for over 2 decades. The cold-blooded murderer convinced federal agents that he was providing information about rival gangs, when in reality he was manipulating his FBI handlers to eliminate competitors and protect his own criminal empire. His reign of terror included at least 19 murders, countless beatings, and a web of extortion that reached from South Boston's housing projects to the highest levels of law enforcement. But Bulger's most chilling characteristic was his complete lack of human empathy, murdering friends, business partners, and even women who posed no threat to his operations simply because killing gave him pleasure. He strangled Deborah Hussey, the daughter of his longtime girlfriend, then buried her body in a basement because she knew too much about his activities. When associate John McIntyre returned from a failed gun-running trip to Ireland, Bulger tortured him for hours before shooting him in the head, his body remaining hidden for decades. The FBI's protection allowed Bulger to operate with virtual impunity until the corruption scandal finally exploded in the 1990s, forcing him to flee Boston and disappear into hiding. For 16 years, he remained one of America's most wanted fugitives, living quietly in Santa Monica, California, until federal agents finally tracked him down in 2011. Even in his 80s, Bulger remained a dangerous predator, and his final chapter came with brutal justice on October 30th, 2018, when fellow inmates at Hazleton Federal Prison in West Virginia beat him to death with a padlock stuffed in a sock just hours after his arrival. His family buried him in St. Joseph Cemetery in West Roxbury, Massachusetts, beneath a simple granite headstone that bears only his name and dates. The modest grave, providing no indication that beneath the New England soil lies one of the most evil men in American criminal history. A monster whose FBI protection allowed him to kill with impunity for decades. From the elaborate mausoleums of crime family patriarchs to the simple headstones of street soldiers, these 20 graves tell the complete story of organized crime in America, a century-long saga of violence, corruption, and ultimately mortality. The cemeteries of New York, Chicago, and beyond hold the remains of men who once commanded armies of criminals, controlled politicians and judges, and generated fortunes that rivaled legitimate corporations. Yet their final resting places reveal the universal truth that power built on fear and violence never survives its architects. St. John Cemetery in Queens has become an unofficial monument to the American Mafia, its grounds holding Lucky Luciano, John Gotti, Vito Genovese, Joe Colombo, and Carmine Galante side by side in death as they never were in life. Their graves draw curious visitors who seek to understand how immigrant communities produced both hard-working citizens and ruthless criminals, how the pursuit of the American dream could be twisted into nightmares of extortion, murder, and betrayal. These final resting places remind us that regardless of wealth, power, or notoriety, every story ends the same way, carved into granite and marble, reduced to names and dates that future generations will struggle to remember. The mobsters who once struck terror into the hearts of honest citizens now rest silently beneath the earth, their empires dissolved, their families scattered, their secrets buried with them in the soil of America.